Hello, everyone, and welcome to this hustings. This is the second hustings we've done in a series of 3. We did one last night in Edmonton. This one is for Southgate and Wood Green, and we'll also be doing one on Monday for Enfield North. It's been organised by Locomotion, which is a local social justice group, by the Enfield Committee for Climate Action, and also with our partner or media partner, Enfield Despatch. And by the way, if you look at Enfield Despatch, it has a biography of every candidate, which is really a good thing for you to look at if you want to know more about the backgrounds of each candidate. We are got quite a number of people who signed up today. We've got about 80 people who said they want to come on, and more I'm sure will join us. We're also streaming this onto YouTube and onto Facebook as well. And the people we've got joining us today are Sharon Lambos, who's the Labour candidate. We've got Charles Grinwardina, who's from the Green Party, Jeff Mosley, who's from the Workers' Party, and Carl Vidal, who's from the Trade Unionist and Socialist candidate. And we don't have Laura Fulbright, unfortunately. She's a Lib Dem, and she had to be called away for business at the last minute. And Matt McLaren has agreed to take her place. Now, Matt, I believe, is the agent for all of the Lib Dem candidates and is well versed in Lib Dem policy. So he'll be great to have here. That's a theory, anyhow. What we plan to do is divide this into 3 sections, because there were 3 important sections that came out in all the work of Locomotion and NCAF, and that is housing, cost of living, and climate change in the environment. And in each of those, we're going to have a short introduction, and then we're going to have a series of questions. Now, those questions are ones that have been sent in to us, and we've had over 50 questions sent in to us. And you can also put your questions in the Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you can see a little icon saying Q&A, and if you have questions, put that on. We'll try and get those in if we can, and we'll deal with the questions we've got. But, be patient with us, because we won't be able to deal with all the questions. We're going to ask each candidate to answer a question that's given them in 1 minute. And we're asking them as well, please, to be positive. That is to say, tell us what the policy is. We don't want to know why you should not vote for another party. We want to know why people should vote for you. So we need, positive answers. Okay, so that's the format for today. And thank you, all of you for joining us. It's great that you've agreed to engage with us in this community way, and that's really important. So let's begin, first of all, Nana, by looking at housing and taking your introduction to that. Okay, Nana, do you want to start?
I was just trying to unmute, apologies. Okay, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't turn on my camera, but okay. Well, okay, right. Good evening, everybody. So I'm from the Citizens Advice, and I hope you can see the screen that I'm sharing. So this is a depiction of the number of clients that we see, which I'm going to talk through. So this is regarding the housing section. It is widely accepted that Enfield and indeed London is experiencing an unprecedented housing crisis. This is a national crisis that needs a national policy solution. Enfield has the 3rd highest number of families in temporary accommodation or at risk of homelessness in London, according to the Trust for London research data. Historically, at Citizens Advice Enfield, our top 2 issues have been welfare benefits and debt. Housing has always hovered between the 3rd and the 4th position. However, in recent years, between the last year and this year, homelessness and housing has become the second biggest issue, accounting for over 20% of all our client cases. And every year we see up to 6,400 clients. So that's about 5,000 in total. 6,400 every year. So the causes of this: rise in private rents, the local housing allowance freeze, the rise in Section 21 no-fault evictions have led to a steep rise in private renters needing help with homelessness since the pandemic. Private rents are currently unaffordable. Enfield has seen a 246% increase in rent. Some think tanks say that rent should be around 30% of your income, but we're seeing clients who have rent costs of over 50% of their income. There are also inequalities in the housing crisis, with people most affected from ethnic minorities, single parents, and those whose English is not their first language, as well as people on low incomes and people with disabilities. This is predominantly in the east of the borough, further widening the gap, widening the east-west divide. Enfield Council spends nearly 7 million a year supporting people who are homeless in temporary accommodation, which is putting it on the brink of bankruptcy. The council will also need to save approximately 35 million next year to avoid bankruptcy. There are no council properties or affordable homes for people who need it most, and the private rented sector housing stock has dwindled. We are facing a significant housing crisis that requires urgent addressing, and we need urgent, effective policy solutions to this crisis. So I have a clip here from a forum that we held recently, and some feedback from the people who attended the forum on their experiences. So, responsibility do you think it should be to find that home or house for you?
Initially, it's down to us.
Okay.
But with support. I mean, I'm willing to even go as far as go private renting myself, but I can't afford to pay for both the
deposits and the like the deposit and the month's rent and things like that.
Yeah,
People just aren't in the financial situation to be able to do that.
We've got this group here saying that the individuals should be responsible for finding a home if it was very easy to do so. That's why we at the moment rely to the local authority, because it is impossible to rent a property at the moment unless you have a guarantor, unless you have certain income, and unless if you can't provide both, you have to have good money aside to be able to give at least 2 months rent and 2 months deposit.
That's right.
Which, if you have those money, then you're not entitled to benefits.
And a lot of
So
people don't take
it's a very difficult.
Yeah, a lot of people don't take DSS, private renters.
So whose responsibility do you think it should be?
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks, Nanda. Okay, just before we go with the questions, let's say you may wonder why two candidates aren't here. We wrote to Reform, but they did not respond. I spoke to the Conservative candidate some time ago, and he said immediately he had another appointment. I have spoken to him, or I have contacted him several times since, and his office, but there's been no response. But I'm so pleased all of these have turned out. Okay, so let's go to the first question. We just heard about the crisis of housing nationally and in Enfield. A crisis because housing is unaffordable, because there is not a council housing which is affordable, because people have to rent, and because of Section 21, many people can be evicted without cause, and so there's a homelessness problem. And we've got a question from Mary, and she's asked, how do you think this issue can be resolved? And what steps would you take, or what steps do you think should be taken to start implementing change? So let's begin with you, Matt. 1 minute, please.
Thanks for the reminder. So ultimately, the problems that we have both locally and nationally stem from the fact that we just aren't building enough houses. The population has grown, both organically and also obviously with people coming into this country over the last 2-3 decades. And what we haven't done as that population has grown, is build enough homes. And every government of all colours have said, we'll build X number, usually several 100,000, and every single government, and most especially this government, has not been able to do it. So the Liberal Democrats want to build at least 380,000 homes a year, but within that, we want to make sure that 150,000 of those new homes a year are for social rent. And we also to give.
You've got to your minute. You have to try to do it in a minute. Okay, I know it's very difficult. Carl, what's your position on this? And you have to unmute.
Hello, thank you, Francis. Basically, I'm in the building trade. So the housing crisis, the biggest problem is the councils aren't building council houses anymore. Over the last 14 years, the Tories have cut almost half of the funding to local councils. Labour councils like Enfield and Haringey have passed on those cuts without a fight. So no houses have been built. The most important thing, though, is to restore the funding to the local councils so there can be a massive increase in council house building so everyone can have a decent place to live. With the private sector, there should be an end to no-fault evictions. There should be rent controls introduced to cap rents because the prices are just ridiculous, 50 to 60% of people's earnings. All private landlords should be registered and forced by law to make repairs to the properties that they rent out, and the rent should be reduced, and help with mortgages for those who are struggling to pay their mortgages as well.
Okay, you did that within time. Fantastic. Well done. And Bambos.
Thank you, Francis. I'm very aware of the problems with housing as the MP for Enfield Southgate. It was one of the biggest areas that we have for TA. So how would we solve it? Well, first of all, we need to build more houses. So Labour Party is committed to building 1.5 million new homes over the course of the Parliament. We need to make sure that those homes are affordable. So there'll be an obligation on new developments to provide affordable housing. There'll also be a freedom to buy scheme to help young people get onto the housing ladder. And we're also going to look at banning no-fault evictions because that also affects instability with renters and gives landlords huge advantages in doing that. And we'll also look at helping renters challenge unreasonable rent increases. And the other thing we need to look at is why renting is so precarious, because in places like Germany, over half the population rent.
Okay.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, okay, thanks. You did that very well. And Jeff, your turn.
There we go. Yeah, I agree with everybody else. And picking up from Bambos is Europeans, home ownership isn't as widespread in Europe as it is here. And they have rights, they have long-term rights. Whereas here it's a kind of a form of feudalism, modern tyranny, really. Everyone should have a roof over their head. And the reason we don't, as everyone says, is because government has basically cut back on social housing. Thatcher sold off a lot of the housing stock, didn't replace it, and it's been a problem ever since. And I can't help but feel it's kind of a tactic to impoverish the people.
Okay, fine, you did it time too. Thanks very much. And Sharif, your turn.
Thanks, Francis. So before I start answer the question on housing itself, I would like to say that the Green Party manifesto is available online, which lists all our policies. But under the UK's broken electoral system, we actually cannot come to power to implement these policies. So the role of a Green MP would be to hold the next government to account and push them towards a more bold and ambitious program. So my responses at this hustings today will be on this basis of actually scrutinizing policies. Now, people need a decent, secure and affordable place to live. Unfortunately, like the Tories, Labour have come up with a fiscal rule. They've just made something up and then claim there are no funds to build homes that match income levels of workers. Now, this is the crux of the whole housing problem. So as your Green MP, I will challenge these economic myths in Parliament. I will push the next government to build more council homes, for rent control, to remove the benefit cap, to stop no-fault evictions, to fund home installation and green energy for our existing homes, and call for new homes to be built to the passive house standards.
Okay, we've got a question coming up from the chat and a quick Q&A, and let's take that one. It says, in housing, are you willing to force councils to build in controversial areas like the Greenbelt? And that question comes up again and again. So let's take that one. How do you feel about that, Bambos?
So the priority will be to look at building on brownfield sites first and foremost. I think also it's about what is Greenbelt. So places like Cruise Hill is classified as Greenbelt, even though there's been lots of building development there. So I think there needs to be like a look at what is actually classified as Greenbelt. But we need to look at the planning laws. I mean, that is one of the biggest barriers against housing. Local authorities are required by law to identify areas where they can build houses. This is called the local plan. And I know Enfield has done that, and I know the areas that have been identified have caused concern for some local residents. But ultimately, there has to be a trade-off, because you have to build houses somewhere. But the priority would be on brownfield sites and places that are not properly classified as Greenbelt. Perhaps they should be called Greybelt, because there already is development there already. So those would be the priorities under a Labour government.
Okay, thank you. And Jeff, how do you respond to that? You're mute, Jeff. Can you?
Sorry. Yeah, I agree with Bambos. We need to look at brownfield sites, but we also have to consider what the Greenbelt is and what it's for, and the fact that it's been in existence for decades, and it not taking into account the population growth. Perhaps we should be thinking not so much about extending London, but perhaps building, I don't know, something like Milton Keynes, maybe a new town somewhere. But it is an issue. It's something that all governments are going to have to deal with sooner or later, and the sooner they do it, the better.
Okay, and Sheriff, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Greenbelt should be protected, definitely so. Enfield is trying to build in places, even like up in Cruise Hills and stuff. The problem with those areas are that there's not enough adequate transport. So you'll have to have a lot of driving to some of these places, and some of these new, in the local plan, the type of areas that are selected. There are lots and lots of brownfield sites in Enfield that can be used first. And those have to be really selected to be developed first. And for that, you need investment. And I don't think we can look for just private investment to solve social housing, because the private companies are really need profits. That's what that drives them. And they will not solve affordable housing crisis. It needs public investment. And unfortunately, even in the Labour manifesto, they haven't allocated any money for house building. They talk about 1.5 million homes over a parliament. But if you look at the fiscal plan, there's no money allocated for house building.
Okay.
And that will be the biggest problem.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And Carl, how do you respond to that? Make sure you're unmuted this time, because you sound better that way.
I just did it.
Yeah.
I think there should be a democratic decision about where houses are built. Local people should be able to decide as well. And councils shouldn't be giving land away, like Enfield did, to the big developers for Meridian Water. So they gave all the land away instead of earmarking the land to build houses on to a property developer.
Okay, and Matt, I mean, that's quite an interesting point. I mean, Carl mentioned Meridian Water, and lots of people arguing that developers develop for property because 2-bedroom houses, for example, are more profitable than having family homes. And so Meridian Waters and other places do not get the homes that people need. They get the homes that developers want. I mean, is that something that you agree with Carl? And is that something that's important to understand?
Yes, absolutely. So the problem is, I mentioned before that government set targets and then they don't deliver on them. And it's because we have a developer-led housing model. And what developers want to build, as Carl mentioned, is basically expensive properties, people to kind of upscale, or indeed for people to come from elsewhere, either elsewhere in the country or indeed elsewhere in the world, like, Russian oligarchs taking up big properties in central London. That's what developers want to build. And what the Liberal Democrats want to do is we want to free local councils to be able to actually decide what they need in their area. We're not in favour of building over the green belt, and Lauren and her fellow Enfield Lib Dem candidates have fought some of the proposed developments that have been put forward. But what we do want is to unlock the potential for councils to basically do proper community-led housing development and build where we need things. And we also are in favour of garden cities as well.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I mean, we've talked about building partly because of the brownfield versus greenbelt and so on. But one of the big problems we have, and we had a question here from Perry about housing crisis. The housing crisis is we don't have council housing like we used to have when I was younger, which was a long time ago. We have affordable housing that is not affordable. And really, he's asking, how can we afford to build houses that are really affordable for young families in this country? We're not doing that at the moment. We're pretending they are affordable when they're not. How do you respond to that, Bambos?
Well, this has been a huge problem because many local authorities have been forced to sell their stock because of the right to buy legislation. So with the right to buy, people get huge discounts to buy their council home. And even if the councils were able to spend the money coming in, it wouldn't go anywhere near to replacing what's been sold, because some of those discounts can be as high as like 50, 60%. So there's a huge issue there. So what Labour will do is review the increased right to buy discounts that were introduced in 2012 and increase protections on newly built social housing, because they were looking to expand it to housing association properties as well, but I think that was nipped in the bud. So having better protections is certainly one thing that needs to happen, but we also need to make sure that more local authorities are building council houses. I know some have started, but it's nowhere near enough, and we need to make sure that there are council house properties that are built, that there are cheaper rents, and they do go to local people.
Okay, and Jareth, how do you respond to that? I mean, is it building more council houses as we used to the solution? Because social housing with social housing associations very often build homes that are not affordable, but they're called affordable.
That's one of the big problems. So even in these manifestos, people just talk about affordable houses. We know they're not really affordable. So, for example, in Enfield, a median household income is under £40,000, and in Meridian Water, a 2-bed apartment is like £450,000. Now, these are council land which has been used for this, and it's just not suitable for local people. There are a lot of overseas investors who are benefiting more than the local people. So the issue, again, I'm coming back to it, it's these made-up fiscal rules that cause the problem. The government has to invest in council house building, and there's no way around it. And if we continue to avoid that particular discussion, we'll have an ongoing housing crisis, and it cannot get solved because it's not in the interest of private sector to build homes that are suitable to low-income people.
Okay.
So it's something which we have to take on head on.
Okay, thanks. And by the way, you're doing all great on time, which is fantastic. It means we get through more questions. Jeff, how do you respond to that?
How's that?
Yeah.
Sorry, remind me of the question, I beg your pardon.
Well, it's a question of building more council housing rather than having council housing, rather than having social housing, which is defined as affordable, but which isn't.
Well, it's only really affordable to property investors or, you know, relatively wealthy people. I'm sure your average Tory would regard it as affordable because they tend to be rich. There must be more building. I think the Tories absolutely squandered a perfect opportunity, and Labor as well, actually, when we had the financial crash in 2008. John Maynard Keynes taught the world that the way out of economic problems is to invest a massive amount of money in infrastructure projects. And that's what they should have been doing, along with a Green New Deal. But the Tories have been waging an undeclared class war for the last 45 years. And I think part of it is to deliberately impoverish people, return us to a kind of Dickensian world where we're too busy trying to keep a roof over our heads and food in our stomachs than actually to oppose or to argue in any meaningful way with them.
Okay. And Carl, I was just about to ask you to disappear, but you've come back again. So
No, I had to let the cat out.
We all have to do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, quickly. Well, I agree with what most people have said so far. So-called affordable houses are not affordable. So we need mass investment in public housing. But the way we can pay for this is we've got to tax the super rich because the money is there. 20% levy on £795 billion held by the 350 on the Sunday Times rich list would raise £159 billion. Labour have said they're going to give between 5 and 7 billion. So would you think you could do 152 billion more?
Okay, and Matt, would you like to conclude on this?
Yeah, so we want to give councils the right to end the right to buy in their areas if they so wish. And Liberal Democrat controlled councils have a fantastic record on building new council homes because it's absolutely the new council homes that you need to be genuinely affordable. The problem is that under the existing law, they then get sold off as well. In terms of the finances and whether, you know, how we can actually afford to build genuinely affordable homes, we're also being quite clear that we are prepared to borrow for the sake of investment. We believe that there is a distinction in government borrowing between borrowing for day-to-day spend and borrowing to invest in actually building homes that will house people, which adds to the collective wealth of the country. And that's what we're prepared to do. We want to free up councils to be able to build in their areas.
Okay, well, thanks for that. And we've got another question come up through the Q&A, which is, I know, a big question for a lot of people, and it's from Selena. And she says, leasehold properties have been a major problem for young homeowners, especially the exorbitant service charges, which estate managements have continued to abuse. Would you do anything about that at all, Charith?
Absolutely. Not having freehold status on some of these apartment buildings is really bad. And many of these people are just charging very high rates, not just for ground rent, for the lease charges. And you get short lease periods. And then after a certain period, you have to pay the leaseholders a huge amount of money to get the leases extended. So definitely that's something that has to be tackled and tackled very urgently.
And Jeff?
I find the whole concept of leasehold baffling. I'd never heard of it till I came to this country. The idea that you can essentially pay to buy somewhere but only rent it for 99 years is, to me, utterly absurd. And it goes back to the Enclosure Acts that started in the 13th century. And that is that the landed gentry essentially have robbed us of the land from beneath us and are demanding, they're rentiers, they're demanding extortionate rents, and they profit from our work, our hard work, our desire to have a roof over our heads. And they're exploiting one of the most basic essentials in life, and that is somewhere safe to live.
Okay, Matt, you were nodding vigorously at that. So do you want to turn that into words?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Liberal Democrats want to abolish residential leaseholds. It's that straightforward. We think that this, as Jeff was saying, it's a crazy model. It does really quite literally stem out of a feudal system, as somebody mentioned earlier. So we want to abolish residential leaseholds and cap ground rents to a nominal fee, so that ultimately everyone has control over their property. And that's a much better model, and other countries do it, than what we currently have in Britain.
Okay, and Carl, how do you respond to that?
I agree with Matt and Jeff, and I think leaseholds should be abolished. Service charges have been going up faster than rents in many places. We should freeze and control them too. I think service charges should be paid by the person who owns the land.
Okay, and Bambos, I know the Conservatives have sort of got themselves in a bit of a mess on this. They wanted to abolish leasehold, they couldn't do it, and that's a problem. And how does the Labour Party look upon leaseholders?
Well, issues like service charges are an absolute outrage, particularly when you look at things like the Grenfell fire and cladding, and many people's leases are now worthless because the responsibility has been on them to pay for the removal of cladding, and that's clearly unacceptable. We were hoping that this would have been changed with the bill that was going through Parliament, but unfortunately that was watered down to such an effect that it didn't happen. So yes, we do need to see urgent reform. The Law Commission has done great work on this, and that needs to be urgently looked at. Service charges need to be properly scrutinised, because service charges are a license to print money from some of the freeholders, but there are issues in relation to where urgent works are needed. So I know that if you're, say you're a leaseholder in a council block and the lift needed repairing, then the burden falls unfairly, in my view, on the leaseholders, who also have to pay a share of, say, the lift being repaired or doors being. So that needs to be urgently looked at, because it's just unfair, and yeah, it needs to be urgently reviewed. Okay.
We also have a question in from Marie, and it's an interesting one because it talks about older people who are disabled. She says, as a disabled pensioner relying on the state pension and living in private rented accommodation, we feel there is no focus or interest in people in our situation. Why is there little or no easily accessible social housing available to older people? And how do you plan to change this to ensure older vulnerable people have secure tenancies? And that's a really interesting question, because I think in the UK we're behind many other countries in providing that sort of accommodation for older people. How would you address that problem? Let's start with you, Matt.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And ultimately, I mean, she's absolutely right that people do need secure tenancies, especially older people, but all people of all ages need secure tenancies. And Liberal Democrats want to make sure that 3-year tenancy is the standard. And I mean, ultimately, my initial thoughts on hearing the question is that ultimately this stems from a housing market which is broken. This is a housing market where it's not very easy to downsize, for example, which is quite important, especially as people get a bit older in life. And there isn't that security of protection for anyone of any age in terms of social housing available. So we've got to reform the housing market itself. As I said before, we've got to have community-led building rather than developer-led building.
Okay, and Bambos.
Look, I think it's there are various onuses put on developers, but one of them that isn't necessarily put on them is having accessible housing. So I think making it a requirement, just as we require them to have affordable housing, I think requiring them to produce accessible housing would also be one way forward, because we need to increase the stock. Certainly, with Enfield Council, they have very, very few ground floor properties, and people are waiting a long time, and it disproportionately affects people with disabilities, because they're waiting far, far longer than other people. So we need to change that. So one of the ways of doing that is by having certain requirements on developers, and they should include accessible housing as part of their standards whenever they propose a development.
Okay, I mean, we're getting close to the end of this section, so I'm going to go to the next question and ask the two of you I haven't asked on this question, and then maybe come back to the others if we can. I mean, the housing crisis is partly due to not joined up thinking in local authorities. Very often the local authority will move people from one local authority to another, won't accept them, and then they're not allowed back again. And they're in a sort of no man's land. And someone's asked, how do we tackle this lack of joined up working? Will we have enough government intervention to ensure there is joined up working? Or is this a London Assembly issue that we need to do to bring local authorities together to stop this sort of to and froing of people and giving them the mental stress that causes? Charith.
Yeah, I mean, this really is a big issue, again, purely to do with the lack of number of affordable houses in each area. And you cannot solve this again by not investing in council house building and affordable house building. So certainly in Enfield got lots of tenants from or residents from central London, because they did a lot of gentrification down in central London. And it's easier for the central London councils to house people in Enfield. And then it becomes our problem. And now we are shipping lots of residents outside London, and those families are losing their communities, their friends, all their families, and they're having a huge amount of problems themselves. Yeah. So I think the issue here is, once again, funding, government funding for council houses. That's an essential requirement.
Okay, and Jeff?
Yeah, I think we're all agreed, frankly. We should all join our own party. The basic Tory model is every man for himself, whereas progressives like me, it's like all for one and one for all. And the thing is, when people are elderly and they retire and they no longer work, they're regarded as a waste of space by capitalists. And again, this is similar to the earlier question. It's just a question of housing stock. And we've got to get away from this idea of shunting people out of London just because they can't afford to live here. You know, if they grew up here, this is their home. And so we've got to build more houses. It's as simple as that.
And Carl, I mean, do you agree with this new Southgate Hustings political party where we're all agreeing? How do you answer that?
I say passing responsibility does not solve the issue, because the government is ultimately responsible, and it always will come down to funding. They've been cutting funding for 14 years. They've been taking and taking and taking. You need to have housing there in the first place. So if you're taking it away and not replacing it, there's always going to be a problem. There's always going to be an issue. Now, the thing with elderly people, that is part of the social part of the big issue we have with social care, employment, education.
Okay, we're losing.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're losing you. Don't worry, you weren't sounding like Joe Biden. It was your connection. So it's all right. Right, but let's go on to the next section now. We had a good section on housing, and let's go on to cost of living. And I know Nena wants to introduce the cost of living section as well. So Nena, would you like to do that?
Right, what's going on? Here we go.
Hold on, Nena, can you come on again and unmute your mic?
I'm sharing my screen now, so just want to make sure that you can see it. So it's gone. Can you see that?
It's not. Yes, we can now.
Okay, so the cost of living. So Britain is facing its biggest cost of living crisis in decades. At Citizens Advice, we're helping more people than ever before who cannot afford to cover their essential costs like food, energy and housing. Our data gives us unique insights into how the crisis is affecting the people that we help. As the cost of living continues to soar and housing availability dwindles, residents find themselves grappling with the harsh realities of an unyielding housing market and the inability to make ends meet, which is debilitating. It's heartbreakingly clear that the biggest problem over the past 2 years is a negative budget. That's when your income is less than your outgoings. So your outgoings, you're spending more money than you're getting in. Last year, our national office sounded the alarm that half the people we help with debt are in a negative budget. Even after getting expert advice from the Citizens Advice and doing all the right things, they have more going out than coming in. In January this year, 62% of mortgage holders were in negative budget. Meanwhile, 60% of private renters have a negative budget compared to 50% of social housing, as the rising rents drive people more and more into the red. In Enfield, about 40% of households have an average income salary of £30,000. And the average rent in Enfield for a one-bedroom flat is £13,200 a year. And that rises up to 24,000 for a family, for a four-bedroom family home, which is evidently more than the 30% I mentioned earlier, or 50%, it's up to 50% of the income. So I have a case study on here, which is Amina's story, one of our clients, anonymized. So she's a single mother with 3 children, and she's not working. She's a full-time carer. Amina was formerly in her property from 2010 and was evicted in 2023 last year because she could not keep up the rent. Her son had a fall in 2022, and after attending hospital a number of times, she became his carer. All her children were born in Enfield, and she's lived in Enfield for a long time. She has a daughter who's recently diagnosed with autism. She has been working for over 20 years, and recently she reduced her hours to attend to her son, but then she had to give up work completely to look after him because it was too difficult. As a result of a change of circumstances, she's fallen behind on her bills. She owes over £6,000 in council tax due to an overpayment, and she's also fallen behind on other bills and often juggles between feeding her family and paying for other essentials due to rising costs and fixed income. So Amina has also said that her family and herself, her mental health has been affected by this situation. So you can see that her universal credit and carers allowance comes to just under £500 a month. Her outgoings, which is electricity, food and other expenses, comes to £1,191, leaving her with a minus of £692. She's fallen behind, so she's got priority debts of council tax and utilities and rent arrears of £11,000, and she's got non-priority debts, which is all legal charges, student loans, and benefits overpayments of £40,000. So that's one of the impacts of the cost of living crisis that we're in.
Okay, thanks for that. And Amina's case study as a kinship carer is a really, really striking one. And the cost of living crisis is one that is affecting so many families. And we've got a question coming from Regina on this, which is a real challenge to you all to answer in 1 minute. And it's this: if elected, what are your plans to tackle the cost of living crisis in our area and nationally? Charith, you first.
I mean, again, direct public investment is critical to tackle the cost of living crisis. The government cannot rely on private capital to provide a sustainable solution to this issue. Now, the cost of living has 2 parts of this crisis: is declining incomes and, of course, the rising costs of goods and services. So we have a base stagnation, which is not keeping up with inflation. So you need to have a minimum wage of at least £15. The inadequate benefit payments, the universal credit rates are really low, and it's driving people to food banks. That has to really go up, and they can be funded. people's personal debts are going up because again, the services are not adequate, the benefits are not being adequately provided.
What would you do about it? You expressed the problem, the actual problem very eloquently, but what would you offer?
It is actually funding these things, and that's why I said right at the very beginning, having a artificially made up fiscal rule is the problem which the Tories have introduced 14 years ago. And if you look at the current Labour manifesto, they do exactly the same. There's hardly extra spending from the Labour manifesto. So this cost of living crisis will go ahead. They are relying too much on private credit. And when it comes to the rising costs which are going to be faced, there's housing, you need energy costs, you need to invest in insulation and heat pumps and stuff. So there are food crisis, transport crisis, childcare costs.
Okay, you made that point, and I gave you a bit of extra time to answer the subsequent point. But Jeff, how do you respond to that? How would you deal with the cost of living crisis? It's better if you've got your microphone on, so we know how you do it.
Yeah. Sorry, I was writing. Oh gosh, I lost my train of thought again. The cost of living crisis. The money was created as a convenient means of exchange. Now, if you want to read about money and the history of money, read this book. It's called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. It's a brilliant book. It's absolutely magnificent. Money is being used to exploit people. That is to say, if you control the money supply, which is essentially the foundation of neoliberalism, if you control the money supply, then you can control people by basically making sure they don't have enough to live on. And if they don't have enough to live on, they're so busy struggling to survive that they can't do anything else. Now, back in the 70s, the unions were very, very powerful, and they gave the establishment a real fright because of the winter of discontent. And so they've been fighting for 45 years to make sure that that never happens again. So the cost of living, also for the last century, controlling inflation has been economic orthodoxy. So to have inflation or artificially going up, as it has done recently, and without check from the government, has just, I don't understand why it's being allowed to happen, except it's basically class war.
Let's come back to that about economic orthodoxy in a minute, because there's a question which sort of focuses on that particular issue. But Carl, how would you respond to that?
Firstly, I would raise the minimum wage to at least £15 an hour for everyone immediately. I would increase benefits. I would also scrap the 2-child benefit cap, which would bring 250,000 children out of child poverty. I would then also nationalise the energy companies, because last year, the 4 big energy suppliers made £65 billion in profits. That's more than £1 billion a week, while people can't afford to put their heating on, which I think is grossly outrageous. I'd increase the wages of nurses, teachers, firefighters, and other public sector workers. And I will scrap the anti-trade union laws, so workers in the private sector can organise to fight for decent pay rises with the cost of living. And I know someone's going to ask me, how do we pay for that? But I've already explained that, and I'll explain it again if you wish.
Okay, well, that's a really big programme on your first day in Parliament. Matt,
I'll do it in my first hour.
Or even your first hour, yeah. Wow, you're ambitious. Matt, what about you? How would you respond to that?
So Liberal Democrats believe in genuinely having a fair deal for everyone. That's literally the slogan of our campaign this election. And there's lots and lots of policies in our manifesto about how we want to bring that about for lots of different groups of people. But there is one key thing which the Liberal Democrats stand for, which would make a dramatic difference to our overall economy and also the cost of living. And that's the B word, Brexit. Because however you voted in 2016's referendum, I don't think anyone voted to make themselves poorer. But that is what we have done. That is the result of Boris Johnson's so-called oven-ready deal, which effectively
I mean, you're saying that, but you're not saying what you would do. Are you saying we'd go back in the European Union and we wouldn't have a cost of living crisis?
No, we unfortunately, I'd love for us to go back in the EU, but we are realists and we recognise that that's not possible. What we do need to do is renegotiate our terms of trade with Europe. We need to repair our relationships with the single largest transnational market in the world, which is right on our doorstep. We need to cut the red tape and the costs that are literally pushing up people's prices, and eventually, hopefully not too long from now, rejoin the single market and have that frictionless trade with France, Germany, and all the other places, which literally so many British businesses get things from, both both agricultural produce and materials for manufacturing. All these things have become much more expensive since 2020.
Okay, so changing the trading relations is one of the magic solutions, like economic growth is one of the magic solutions. Is yours magic solution, Bad Boss, economic growth that the Labour Party is always talking about, or how would you address the cost of living?
Well, growth is one of the ways, so we need to create conditions for investment in the UK. If more people are working, there's more money going into the coffers of the government, which means that there's more money to spend, which would help sort of keep things like inflation low. So one of the things that the government would do, particularly with the MENA story, is bring down the cost of energy by having a brand new GB energy company to provide cheap, affordable energy. We'd also make sure that inflation is very low, so we'd keep inflation as low as possible. We wouldn't see the spikes in inflation that we saw in recent years. We'd also try and expand access to childcare, and also make sure that work pays, because if people are working, they should be working and earning a decent wage. And we're also going to introduce free breakfast clubs in primary schools, which should also help. So those are the sort of things that we'd want to introduce.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite interesting listening to all your answers. Not one of you mentioned universal basic income. Is that something that you would support? I mean, if you could say briefly, like 15 seconds, starting with you, Chara.
Yeah, universal basic income is something that is being looked at by the Green Party, but also in parallel thinking for job guarantee programs, because it has to go hand in hand with another scheme. So if there's some person who's able to work and willing to work, there needs to be a job for them, which pays a living wage. Now, if the private sector cannot give them that job,
so you agree with that, yeah?
Yeah, then then you need to have a...
Yeah. Okay, I just want a short answer to see what your position is on that. And Jeff, is that something you agree? I noticed you put your hand up when I mentioned it.
Absolutely. Some years ago, I started rethinking how we should do the economy, and it struck me that working people, why are we paying income tax? We've only been paying income tax for a little over a century. Sorry.
Yeah, but it's okay. All I want to know basically is if you agree with the
Absolutely.
UBI. You do. And Carl, do you agree with it?
No. We need to increase wages and benefits so everybody has an opportunity to be able to live. Okay, and Matt.
So the Liberal Democrats did a lot of work on this in the last couple of years, because there was a big debate within our party about this and whether or not to embrace UBI at this stage. And we came to the conclusion that any meaningful UBI policy that was actually going to deliver a genuinely basic income you could live on was completely unaffordable in the current economic model. So what we want to see is a guaranteed basic income, which is a safety net, which is actually a safety net. So if you fall on hard times, or indeed if you're working but you are not actually receiving the due rewards from your work, that you get support from the government. And that's what our package of policies in this election add up to.
Okay, and Bambos, what's your position on this?
I'd say no, because I think it needs to be targeted. But I know this has been tried out in America, in some Scandinavian countries. So I'm open to persuasion. But I think as it stands, we need to give targeted help to those that need it the most. And that wouldn't be achieved by a universal basic income.
Yeah, okay, you're right. I mean, it has been piloted in many countries, including Canada, in fact. Okay, let's go on to another question. But before we do, let me remind you, if you want to ask questions, please put it in the Q&A. We've had quite a few up and we've taken some of them. Let's look at this. We're talking about people's cost of living. And one part of society that's coming to help people who are in a vulnerable situation is the voluntary sector. We saw them sort of come up to the mark during COVID, when lots of mutual aid groups got together and they worked and they helped people who were in difficulties because of that. And the voluntary sector has been so important. But we've had one question saying that that's not been really mentioned, the voluntary sector, in any of the party manifestos. And the voluntary sector is important. And it's been mentioned, for example, in Enfield, the voluntary sector, many of them are at community house, and their funding has been cut by 47%, meaning they have to pay £10,000 more in rent, and the voluntary sector could, in that area, be decimated. What is your position on the voluntary sector? How can you get them more involved, give them the security and the finance they need, and not discriminate against them in a way that has happened at community house? Matt.
Yeah, I mean, the voluntary sector is very close to my heart. I've been involved with charities for years and worked professionally with them as well. They haven't been mentioned in this election, actually. It's a good question because it's almost like the missing piece in the debate. One of the things which the Liberal Democrats have really highlighted, or tried our best to highlight during the course of this election campaign, is care in particular. And I know for a fact that the voluntary sector, both individuals caring for relatives as carers for loved ones, but also organisations providing social care services. Care is literally relies on charities and volunteers in order to function in this country. We don't think that it should in the same way. We think that those organisations who do that should get a lot more money and a lot more investment behind them, because certainly the organisations running care services in this country know what they're doing, but they are just not supported by the government. So we have a package of proposals around care in our manifesto. We want to see unpaid carers get a lot more support from the government, but we also want to see a lot more investment in the social care sector and supporting charities doing that.
Okay, and Gareth?
Absolutely. The work done by these organizations are immensely valuable for the communities. So certainly there needs to be right level of support and funding for these things. Certainly the implementation of that should be done at local levels, but the funding needs to come from the national level, because to carry out some of this work, you need to be close to the area where the services need to be delivered. But certainly things like volunteers working in food banks, I mean, our aim should be to eliminate those food banks. I mean, there really should not be any food banks in the country. If you look at the rate of the numbers of increase of these food banks, we should be all working to get rid of that. But certainly, you can't really rely on only voluntary work to that. People who are working in these areas need to also be paid for some of those immensely useful and valuable work they're doing. So it has to be funded once again from central government.
And that's why do you think the voluntary sector has been omitted so much from all the manifestos? Hi, Bambos, can you hear us?
Sorry, Francis. So, look, I think the voluntary sector needs to be involved directly with government. I think it shouldn't be an afterthought, because they play such a huge role in providing services and actually reaching places that councils and the government can't reach. So I think the need is definitely there for greater engagement. And also from that, there should be direct core funding. I was the chair of the Enfield Law Centre for a while, and the problem was that we had to chase funding for different particular projects, but the actual not having core funding to do our everyday business was a huge problem, because you're constantly chasing funding for particular projects. So I think more core funding to enable the voluntary sector to operate properly is going to be key to this. But they need to have a clear voice with local authorities and the government.
So do you have a view about community house, for example, and the increase in rents that they have to pay that might put some of them out of business?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't support those increases. I mean, I know the EDA, the Enfield Disablement Association, they had to close a community house, and it's a travesty because they provided great advocacy for people with disabilities, and that's gone now, and those people are very vulnerable and need as much support as they can. So anything that can, and often there are other reasons why the voluntary sector is struggling. It's not always funding, but I think enabling them to function better would be a big priority.
Okay, and Jeff, what's your attitude towards the voluntary sector?
I think it's bizarre it even exists. The foundation of capitalism is that people work for a living, and the idea that I just think conservatives exploit the good people who are willing to do volunteer work. I think they should be paid. I don't think people should be working for free. And I agree that food banks should be eliminated. There's no need for food banks. The reason, listen, it's simple. We tax the super rich with super taxes, which is what we used to have after the Second World War. The top rate of tax was 95%. You had to earn a lot of money to pay that. But this is what we need to be doing. These people are having a nice old ride off the shoulders and the backs of working people who are prepared to work for nothing for the benefit of other people.
Okay, so you think volunteers should be paid? There's hope for me yet then. Carl, how do you react?
I agree with Jeff in some parts. This comes back to the question on housing and councils. Councils are cutting back on all services, which they've been doing for far too long. Labour has been carrying out these Tory cuts and not fighting them. We need more spending. The council should set needs no cuts budgets based on what local people need. I'm a volunteer. I volunteer my services because I think it's a good thing to do in my community. But volunteers are being exploited because they don't get paid. So like all things, they would rather, like in our daily lives today, they want us to work for nothing. And I think that's not right. We should get paid for doing an hourly job, hourly rate, a decent hourly rate. If you're a volunteer, you do it out of the goodness of your heart, but they should get paid as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. We've got some questions on spending cuts, which is really quite interesting. I mean, Ian has said, for example, public services are crumbling. They need a massive injection of cash. Are they going to get it from you? And who should pay for it? And David Flint has actually said that independent analysis, and by that I think he means the Institute of Fiscal Studies, shows that both Labour and Tory manifestos imply public spending cuts of about £20 billion per year. To be fair, I think he also criticised the Green Party, sorry, not he did, but the IFS criticised the Green Party and the Lib Dems policies as well as being over-optimistic. And so there's been criticism from independent experts of the spending plans of all of the parties. So what that would mean if you could not achieve what you wanted, that you would have to raise taxes or cut public services. And David Flint's question, I think, to the Labour and Tory, but we'll put it to the Greens and the rest of you as well, is if elected and you were in this situation where you could not achieve your economic goals you want, what services would you cut first? Matt?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I reject the premise of the question in as much as the Liberal Democrats have put forward quite an ambitious plan for funding, including some of the new funding commitments that we put forward on our manifesto. So, for example, we want to reverse the Conservative tax cuts for the big banks. We want to increase the digital services tax from 2% to 6%. We want to reform capital gains tax to close loopholes by the super wealthy, because that is often exploited by people. So there are real meaningful tax changes we can make to the system, which do not increase the tax paid by ordinary hardworking people or those on pensions, but actually basically tax the people who are gaining the most from the current economic model, including those big online companies that make huge profits and pay very little tax. And that's where we want to get the money. I do accept the next Parliament, whoever is the government, they will find a very tough time. Jeremy Hunt has baked into the current budget, which both Labour and Tories have accepted, about £18 billion worth of spending cuts. And the country cannot afford those. So certainly if I were in government, I would want that to be addressed by more tax increases, not by public spending cuts.
Okay, you think you won't have to make public spending cuts. The IFS probably disagrees with you on that. Carl, do you think you would be in a position with your policies, if they did not succeed, where you would have to make public spending cuts?
No, I already answered that question. I think we need to tax the super rich. We need to make major companies make major companies into public ownership, or take them into public ownership, I should say. We also need to democratically plan the economy. We would make no cuts.
You make no cuts, so you're pretty optimistic that all your plans will work and no cuts will be made. Okay, and are you the same?
I'm not saying I'm not saying it would work. I'm just saying that the money is there. The money's always been there.
Okay.
If people are making profits, the money's there.
Yeah, and Jeff, you said
they're making billions in profit.
Yeah, and Jeff, you said in an earlier answer that we're following, traditional economic theories, and the money supply is there if we want it. Would you feel, with your background and your ideas, cuts would have to be made, or could you print money?
I wouldn't even consider making cuts. And when you say print money, it's amazing just how much money could be found by the government in the economic crash. They came up with £1.25 trillion over a weekend. Yeah. There's absolutely I wouldn't even dream of it. My plan is to tax the rich until their eyeballs bleed. They've been taking liberties for decades. And the neoliberalism has turned millionaires into billionaires and the working class into the working poor. It's outrageous. So absolutely not. No cuts at all. And here's the other thing. We are a sovereign nation with our own currency, this is why the euro is a dangerous thing. Yeah. We have the ability to control our own fiscal policies, and we will never go bankrupt. The Americans are $17 trillion in debt.
Okay, so, I mean, that's an interesting argument, because you're advocating what's called monetary economic theory, modern economic theory, which we haven't got time to go in, but it follows what you say. Boss, what about you? I mean, if the economic growth that you want doesn't happen, and you think it will, but the 1964 Labour government said the same and the economic growth didn't happen. If that happens again this time, you don't achieve your growth ambitions, what cuts do you think would have to be made?
Well, again, I think growth will happen, because we won't have the instability that we had under the Conservatives in recent years. So I think there will be growth, because you'll have a sensible, stable government. But hypothetically, where we've seen cuts happen have tended to be in the areas of the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office. Those are sort of areas that face sort of cuts. So I think those are the but they've been cut so much now that I don't see how you can cut them even more, because it's public services that are very they're really struggling in those areas as well. So I don't know, but I'm confident that we will have growth, and there won't be any need to look at cuts or raise taxes for individuals.
Okay, so you're all confident there'll be no cuts, and in the next 5 years we'll be able to see if you are correct on that. Right, one more question in this section, and it is this from someone who has left their name. but he or she has said, we have seen an expansion of food banks and support in schools to help families cope with the cost of living crisis. Do you think it would be better use of resources to offer a fairer system, such as reverting back to benefits for each child rather than the two-child cap, which has financial impact on the whole family? How do you react to that, Sheriff?
I mean, that's one of the most scandalous policies that Tories have implemented. And the fact that Labour are continuing that two-child benefit cap is really a shameful policy to have. I think, like we had discussed earlier, there's enough ways to get the funding. You need to do that. And when you stop, when you introduce that type of cap, the entire family struggles. And all the children who have no part to play in that will suffer by those benefit caps, and for no fault of their own. So those type of policies absolutely should not be there. And certainly, if you are in Parliament, we'll be fighting whatever government is there to try and get that benefit cap turned around.
Okay, and Carl, how would you deal with that? You're smiling, so you clearly have an answer.
Well, absolutely. We need benefit for every child that reflects the real cost of raising children, especially in this era of, cost cutting and benefits being taken away, and resources and heating and cold, and people not being able to eat food. And, we need to create a system where the real cost of raising children is taken by us all, and that can be paid for.
Okay, and Jeff?
Again, tax the rich. We can fix everything. There's plenty of money sloshing around in this economy, but it's all going to the top. Have any of you done the billion-second challenge? How long is a billion seconds? I'll help you out here. 1 million seconds is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is 32.5 years. That's the difference between millionaires and billionaires. That level of wealth is obscene. It crosses a threshold where money stops being something that you use to buy goods, and it's in actual fact just used as for leverage of power to get legislation done your way. So the idea, while rich people are buying themselves yachts, makes me sick to the stomach.
Okay, and Matt, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Liberal Democrats would absolutely end the two-child benefit cap, and for very good reason. It is just the most efficient way of pushing children into poverty, which is an astonishing effect of government policy. And to be fair, I am quite shocked that the Labour Party, of all parties, is not proposing to reverse that. I don't want to say too much about it because it's her details, not mine, but a very close relative of mine was subject briefly to the two-child benefit cap in error because she had a difficult situation where she had 3 children, but one wasn't living with her. And literally for a period of 3 or 4 months while it was being sorted out, she could not put money on the electric meter. She couldn't put food on the table without help from people like me and others around her. It is shocking. And this government and any future Labour government should be ashamed of themselves if they don't change it.
And Ambos, are you in favour or would you change it?
Well, I'm sure if financial circumstances allow, then we'd want to get rid of it along with everyone else. But the whole issue about food banks and the reliance on food banks, I mean, there are many working people that use food banks. So I think we need to look at why society is dependent on food banks, why they've suddenly sort of shot up everywhere. So certainly looking at why working people, why are reliant on food banks, and changing that. So we need to make sure that work pays and people don't need to rely on that. So it is about the cost of living. But yeah, I mean, if finances allow, then we should get rid of the two-child cap.
Okay, all right. So we've sort of come to the end of the cost of living part.
Hang on, can I just interrupt here, please?
Pardon?
While finances allow, we make them allow. Goodness sake.
But do you want to respond to that very quickly, Rambos? Would finances, if finances allow, what do you mean by that? Because you, in the other question where we were talking about economic growth, if you don't get that, we said there could be cuts. You think you will have the economic growth. So those are the circumstances that you think will allow you to do what you want to do. What's your response?
I don't, we need growth, we need more, but there are so many things that we want to do that, you know, we can't do. We haven't got like a, you know, the Labour Party manifesto is actually quite modest in what it's trying to achieve. I think the costings, I think maximum would be like 14 billion, which is like a tenth of what the Green Party's manifesto is hoping to achieve. So, so yeah, we need to cut our cloth accordingly. There are lots of things that we need investment in, and it needs to be paid for somehow. And I think we need to be realistic about that. I mean, this idea that if you just you know, this idea that the rich will just let you tax them. I mean, the Rolling Stones were living in the south of France for much of the time when the super wealth tax was being applied, so they weren't paying any tax. So I think it's fantasy if you think that the rich will just allow themselves to be taxed without using clever accountants to get out of it.
Okay,
Let me
I'm going to stop this section because I want to go on to the next section, so we are fair to every section of this. I mean, we've ended this on an area of disagreement, which is good in a way because it's nice to know there are differences. But the other section that we're going to look at is climate change and the environment. And we've got a clip of a video that was done by Ariana Abdul-Noor, who is a local person and who was the UK youth delegate to COP28. And we're going to play that in first and then ask some questions around climate change. So here we go.
Climate change is a crucial issue in the upcoming UK election, directly influencing policies on energy, infrastructure, and public health. The UK, as a leading industrial nation, has a significant role in global efforts to combat climate change. Voters are increasingly aware of the need for strong environmental policies to reduce carbon emissions and to transition to renewable energy sources. Valuing green space is crucial in the UK, where urban areas are densely populated. These spaces not only serve as carbon sinks, absorbing CO2, but also mitigate urban heat island effects, reducing temperatures in cities. Green spaces improve air quality, support biodiversity, and provide recreational areas that enhance physical and mental well-being. In the upcoming elections, both the Labour Party and Green Party are aiming for ambitious targets of net zero by 2030, focusing on a Green New Deal. Their manifestos pledge to work with private sectors to double onshore wind, triple solar power, and quadruple offshore wind, creating millions of green jobs. Both also emphasise the importance of preserving and expanding green spaces in urban and rural areas. Similarly, the Liberal Democrats and Conservative parties have also pledged to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2045 and 2050 respectively, promising significant investments in offshore wind and hydrogen energy. They both also emphasise protecting and expanding green spaces with plans to support reforestation efforts and restore peatlands, crucial for carbon sequestration. As the planet heats up, prioritising climate action and environmental preservation in this election is essential. Policies that promote sustainable practices, protect natural landscapes, and invest in green technologies will help ensure a resilient future for the UK. Voting for parties with strong climate policies ensures a commitment to a sustainable and green future, with this election serving as a crucial opportunity for voters to support leaders committed to doing so. Because the climate change emergency is so critical, we would like to hear how commitments to these pledges can be actualised so that we can see concrete changes. At such a crucial juncture, how willing are these parties to go beyond their manifesto agreement?
Okay, I think Ariana stated the position really well on that. And we've had several questions. In fact, we've had more questions on climate change and the environment than anything else. And one question which two other people also ask in different words, one from Basil, one from Tricia Sharp, and one was anonymous. And basically it was asking this: what do you think is the issue that is most pressing relating to climate change and the environment, and why? And if you're elected as an MP, how do you plan to make your voice heard on this issue, both inside and outside Parliament? And what is the likely success in your view? Okay, Charith, over to you in the Green Party.
I mean, the climate crisis is real. The pollution is causing lots of damage around the world. And you have to look at it in multiple ways. This is a global issue. It's not just relevant to the country of just the UK itself. So from a global point of view, there are certain things which we really also have to contribute to help manage the climate emergency. So certainly in terms of stopping these big wars happening, which is causing a lot of destruction and causing the countries of the global south to have lots of problems, we have to try to support them and facilitate them to get out of those crises. Unfortunately, countries like in the global north are contributing to the problems there. Now, at a local level, there are certain ways that we have to change our behaviors to try and reduce some of these things. And there are ways to manage that with things like carbon taxes, where the polluters pay. We need to do windfall taxes to people who are actually causing environmental damage with fossil fuels. We can introduce frequent flyer levies, because the airline industry is causing a lot of issues at the moment. There are retrofitting homes. We can use keep the energy that's produced within the homes rather than losing that. And there are a lot of other schemes, things like insulating homes, which we really need to invest in to try and tackle this crisis.
Okay, fine, thanks. And Jeff, how would you address this problem?
Back in the 30s, Franklin D. Roosevelt instituted the New Deal based on the theories of John Maynard Keynes. And we need a new deal. And this is a perfect opportunity for a Green New Deal. Invest heavily in renewables. One thing that has been mentioned is thermal energy. It's critical. And we have one government after another just kicking the can down the road because they don't want to embark on it, because it means they're going to have to raise taxes. And they don't want to raise taxes on ordinary folk because they won't get voted in. And they don't want to raise taxes on rich folk because that's going to affect their donors.
Well, and Bambos, you did have a Green New Deal at one point. Rachel Reeves, I remember, projected it quite enthusiastically at a Labour Party conference, and then you went back on it. What happened?
Well, so I'll deal with the, okay, well, with that one, clearly we are going to invest. We're going to invest hugely in the UK, and there will be lots of investment. We're investing in the in clean energy. We're going to have GB Energy, which will certainly be promoting or putting forward like clean energy that will be cheap and affordable for the UK, which is good for our security as well. But on the wider issue, I mean, the UK is responsible for 2% of the world's CO2 emissions. Every year we have these COP summits, and I think one of the key things is for us to use our international influence to make sure that those promises that are made are actually stuck to. Because if we don't get the countries like India and China and the USA, who are the biggest emitters of CO2 emissions, to cut their emissions, then what we do is going to be a drop in the ocean in trying to find a solution for the world overheating and for our existence, you know, going further and further to the end, for us having facing extinction in the not too distant future. So I think putting pressure on governments who do make promises to stick to them would be one way that we should certainly be looking at, to make sure that that we don't go above the 1.5% that we're already at anyway, and we try and slow it down.
Carl, how do you respond to that?
Climate crisis. The climate crisis is due to greed. The main polluters are the rich and the big corporations. They should be the one to pay for the climate crisis, like our waters. They're polluting the waters, BP and Shell, rubbish into the sea. Not the working class. I don't know why we have to pay for it. The energy companies and the water companies are all polluting industries. They should be taken into public ownership so that the climate and working class people's needs come before the huge profits. There should be massive investment in sustainable energy.
Okay, and Matt.
Yeah, so I think the question was what, I think the question was what the most major issue facing us with climate change is. And I think, if I'm being honest, that's probably the changing weather patterns. We're already seeing the result of this. So it's not only going to change the UK's weather, so that we have quite a lot more dramatic events. We used to very mild weather, with the weather being within quite a narrow range, and it's going to get much more extreme. It's already started to do that, but globally it's going to be a massive problem. If we think that migration is an issue now, globally it's going to become tenfold, because of so much of the world is going to become uninhabitable. And that's even if we stay within the two degree limit. That is the intention of the international agreements. So it has to be the number one priority for any government and all governments. It has to be recognized as the existential threat to human civilization that it is. And we need to take this really seriously. Now, Liberal Democrats, we've made the mistake of making promises we can't keep before. So we haven't suggested an earlier deadline for net zero than 2045, because we just don't think it's realistically achievable. But we have a whole set of policies, including a net zero delivery authority and a new chief secretary for sustainability in the Treasury, that would actually help the government, whoever is in power, deliver this.
Okay, thanks. I mean, Amber said we have to do our best as we have to keep increases in temperatures below 1.5 by the end of the century. Problem is, we've already gone over that on a couple of occasions now, and many scientists are saying by the end of this decade we will have gone well over 1.5, and many are now saying by the end of the century we could be 3, 4, 5, or 6% above, and that's catastrophic. So we really have to do something, as Matt said, and Quinton Griven has put a question in, and he said, will you commit to the meeting carbon caps of at least 68% by 2030 as obliged by the Climate Change Act and the Paris Agreement, and funding the necessary works? Are you in favour of that, Pambos?
Well, yes, we should be meeting our international obligations. So, you know, we need to invest more in energies, in things like carbon capture. We also need to make sure that we're not giving new licenses for things that are polluting, like the oil and gas fields, and also need to ban things like fracking, which also are bad for the environment. So yes, so we do need to make sure that we are taking steps that we have legally signed up to, and making sure that we are abiding by our legal obligations.
And is that your view, Sharif, or do we go beyond that?
I mean, certainly if you look at on Labour Party's manifesto, they are allocating 1.2 billion new money for the climate plan, and that's hugely not enough. And that's why Green Party are saying we have to raise money right now if you take that thing very seriously. You cannot wait till the economy may or may not improve to make these investments. And like Jeff was also saying earlier, there is money in the system. The whole thing about not making up this fiscal role and not doing something so critical is highly damaging to the country. And the other thing which doesn't happen at the moment is our commitments to the global spendings, the global climate issues. We never meet those. There was a commitment for allocating 100 billion towards the global climate issues. Those are not being funded. And also a lot of the climate reparation type of issues which you need to also solve is not being happening. And what is not happening more seriously is that the burden of the transition to a green economy cannot be carried by the poorest people. And it's the countries like in the UK, and also the people who have the wealth are the ones who have to make the sacrifice now.
I'm going to come to that point in a sec, Sharif, because it's a really important one. But just to answer the point that Quinton raised, how do you respond to that, Jeff?
I have my doubts about carbon tax, because one thing that struck me about this country, whenever there's a problem, they tax it as a disincentive to use it. If we impose carbon tax, that tax is going to be.
But he's not talking about carbon tax, Jeff. He's talking about committing ourselves to carbon cuts by at least 68% by 2030.
Well, that's an ambitious target. I'll give him that. I'm all for it, but I'm not confident we're going to hit it. I mean, we keep having targets placed before us that we never hit. You know, it's just.
Okay,
yes.
no, okay.
I'm all for it. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, and we'll come back to you, Carl. I'll try not to cut you off this time. I thought the last time you were making a dramatic pause, but
yeah. No, we're just talking about there should be massive investment in sustainable energy, insulating homes, retrofitting houses paid for by the government, not out of the working class people's pockets. And an integrated public transport system, buses, trains, should all be publicly owned, fully funded, and democratically controlled, and run in the interest of passengers and protecting the environment. To end the climate change, we need international cooperation. We won't get that under a capitalist system based on competition and chasing after profits. That's why, as a socialist, I'm fighting for a socialist world free from poverty, inequality, war, and environmental destruction. We can only do this if we do this as one people, understanding the goal is to save our planet.
okay, and Matt.
Yeah, so the Liberal Democrats have unambiguously committed to meeting the UK's commitment under the Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions by 68% by 2030. What I would say is I want to slightly call out what some of the panelists have said throughout the evening about capitalism and implying that there is some sort of magic money tree, because that is an ambitious target. It's only six years away, and there isn't in reality a magic money tree. Even if I was a signed up committed socialist, which I'm not, and the Liberal Democrats definitely aren't, the rest of the world isn't. So we've got to be realistic in how we do things. Unfortunately, that realism, certainly in Labour's case, seems to have been forces them to be a bit too cautious. And I do think, as I said earlier on, that you can borrow to invest. And certainly with this target and other targets like it that are going to require a lot of investment, that's exactly what any future government will do. If Lauren's elected and any Liberal Democrat MP is elected on July the 5th, they will make sure that the new government will actually honour its commitments under the international agreements.
Okay, I mean, you talked about what we can do and what we should do to limit the increase in greenhouse gases, and clearly one of the things we have to do is stop carbon dioxide and methane going into the atmosphere. And we've got a question here from an anonymous person, and it says, the Rosebank oil field was recently licensed. Its use would go against all climate commitments to net zero. What would you do to prevent this new oil field from being developed? Let's go to you first, Jeff.
Put a stop to it. It's as simple as that.
Well, that's easy. Charith, is it as easy as that?
It definitely as easy as that, because you cannot expect other countries to follow, not do the same things when the countries who have benefited from all this pollution continue to exploit the environment as it is. I mean, earlier, I think someone mentioned about India and China and stuff. The levels of poverty in those places are absolutely enormous. You can't expect those people to make any sacrifices while we sort of grow, pollute, or license for more of these fossil fuel system to be exploited.
Okay, and for you, Carl, is it as easy as that? Just stop it.
Yes. We should stop licensing oil fields, but workers will lose their jobs, so they have to be redeployed to make useful things. We breathe out CO2, the trees breathe in oxygen, but we're still chopping down trees to make building materials. Timber is one of the biggest, I'm in the building trade, biggest building materials. We don't need to use timber anymore. we've got 21st century composite materials that we can use instead of timber. So we don't need to be chopping down trees. It's just for profit.
Okay, and Matt, would you stop both existing and new contracts on oil fields?
So I don't think the Liberal Democrats would approve any new licenses for extraction in the North Sea. But I also don't think that we are minded to cancel existing ones that have been granted, partly because the problem we've had in this country in recent years under Conservative governments is the instability and the changing of regimes, and the new minister this week decides to go and do something different. We just don't want to add to that instability. Where we are absolutely committed is reaching that net zero goal and making sure that there is a new green industrial revolution in this country. The Liberal Democrat commitments on this can be seen plain as day, because throughout the whole 2010 to 2015 coalition, it was the Liberal Democrat in the Secretary of State's Energy and Climate Change, latterly Ed Davey, for the last 3 years of that government. And under that government, and as a result of that government, and as a result of Liberal Democrat policy, you saw it, the Conservative attitude when they said cut the green crap, and then they consequently did after we left government. But we made sure that Britain is a world leader in renewable energy, and that's exactly what we'll do again, and that's exactly what we will advocate any future government do.
And Bambos, what's your position on the Rosebank oil field?
Well, unfortunately, the license has already been granted, so I don't think we will be reversing that. But what we have said is no new licenses for oil and gas fields, and also no new coal licenses either. So we're committed to achieving net zero as soon as we can, and that's our policy on that one. But trying to go back and change the past is going to be impossible.
Okay, well, let's go to a point that you keep trying to raise, Charith, and it is an important point, and it's about the impact of climate change on different communities, the most vulnerable communities. And we've got a question from Ali Hassami, who is in fact the co-chair of the local United Nations Association. And he asks, what are your committed policies for tackling climate impact and protection of the vulnerable groups in this borough to start with? Do we know what specific climate change impacts are? And is there a funded national plan for a proactive action? I mean, you've talked about, Charith, you talked about internationally the vulnerable communities in other countries, but we know even within an existing country like our own, it's the vulnerable communities that are affected the most. So East Edmonton, or East Enfield, which includes Edmonton and further up, are likely to suffer more than the West, where there's lack of green trees, lack of green space, greater density of population, and poverty. So how do we adopt a climate change policy that helps the most vulnerable communities in our borough? Starting with you, Carl.
It's always the poorest who suffer in a system where profit rules. Always the poorest. So, you know, our job is to represent the poorest of our community, of our constituency.
Jeff?
What Carl said, you know, I keep coming back to it, tax the rich. We should introduce a wealth tax. The idea that wealthy people are just going to up sticks and go somewhere else, the question is, where are they going to go? And they're not going to go so long as they're making a ton of money here. So
yeah,
we just...
Sorry, can I ask you, I mean, the question really is, how do we help vulnerable communities in our own borough? I mean, what would you do, for example, in the east of the borough, where there's dense population, lack of green space? What would you do to help them, you know, protect themselves against the ravages of climate change? Because we know that they're more likely to die of, for example, excess heat than people in the West.
Are you talking about internationally?
No, I'm talking about here in Enfield, even, where we have in the east of the borough deprived communities who would suffer more because of climate change than people in the West.
Well, like Carl said, we just got to look out for them. You know, we've got to find the money to do it. You know, the Tory method of governing is about not paying tax and basically shifting the burden of of living and paying for this country onto the shoulders of the poor. So it's just a question of getting the money to do what needs to be done. I mean, just tax wealthy people and fund poorer communities. I remember Rishi Sunak famously said at wherever it was, that he did a great job of redirecting money that had been going into poor urban communities into leafy green communities. That's the kind of, and you know, Labor, I'm not convinced Labor are going to do anything better, frankly. I think they're just Tory light.
Okay, and Matt, I mean, do you have any specific ideas about how you can help the vulnerable communities address climate change and the adaptation that's needed in our own borough?
Yeah, absolutely. I should also just like to point out that obviously the Southgate and Wood Green constituency, as is now, includes four wards in Haringey as well. So it's not just Enfield. But the biggest change, I mean, if you elect Lauren, if you elect a Liberal Democrat MP, as Sharif was saying earlier, like the reality is Liberal Democrats, we're not going to form the next government. We're not going to be, you know, Ed Davey's not going to be Prime Minister. But what Lauren will do and what any Liberal Democrat MP will do is be a champion for their area. And in particular, there's one policy which could make a really big difference, especially to people in Edmonton, which is the Edmonton incinerator. And the Labour-run council in Enfield, the Labour-run council in Haringey, and across North London, and even supported by Barnet Conservative councillors, all approved this massive expansion of the Edmonton incinerator. It's going to pump huge amounts of toxic pollution into the air that people breathe in those more deprived areas. And also it's going to increase the incentive for councils to burn rubbish, adding to emissions, adding to the climate change problems. So we've really got to end that. And Liberal Democrats at all levels of government, if and when elected, will campaign to get rid of that policy and scrap the expansion.
Okay, I mean, we had a question on the incinerator, which I didn't think we had time to get to, but you raised it. So Bambos, the incinerator, the lack of trees in streets, the lack of green spaces in the east of the borough, how do we address that problem? Because we know that if you have those green spaces and there is a heat wave, the temperature where there are green spaces can be something like 10% lower than where it doesn't exist.
There are some green spaces in the east of the borough, so it's about making best use of those. It's also about creating sort of pocket parks. So it is about planting trees. It is about sort of making those spaces more accessible, and it is about sort of looking at the air quality. It's about public health as well. So it's about sort of monitoring what's happening in those areas. I mean, unfortunately, Enfield is bordered by a number of main roads. So it has the A406 in the south, the M25, and it's got the A10 going through it. So air quality does affect children and vulnerable people as well through car emissions. So we need to look at all those things and just make the most of what we have. Also, just you know, we have Lee Valley Park on our doorstep as well. So trying to encourage people to use the spaces that are accessible, that might just be a bus ride away, and get people, you know, to enjoy what is out there, but also investing in those areas too.
Okay, well, thank you for dealing with those topics on climate change and the environment. We've got a little time left, maybe 10 minutes to deal with other questions. And one that came up last night was interesting, and it's here today from Roy. And it's one which is interesting because we've got a major party here, we've got smaller parties. And the question is, will any of the candidates agree that our current first past the post voting system is broken? And will they advocate for a new system based upon proportional representation, such as single transferable vote, or STV as it's called? What's your view on that, Jeff? Would you go for that?
Absolutely. I find first past the post to be completely anti-democratic. One thing that struck me when I first arrived in this country is just how anti-democratic democracy is here. It's not wrong. You know, we have, like, take the Greens, for example. The Greens had, what, 800,000 votes, and they got one seat. It's ridiculous. And I come from a country where we have what you call AV, what we call preferential voting. that's better than first past the post, but I don't think it's anywhere near as good as proportional representation. And if you're genuinely interested in democracy, you have to basically accommodate everybody's opinion. We have a situation where any party, Labor this time around, Tories the last time around, they get a tiny proportion, or relatively tiny proportion of votes, and yet have a majority of seats. It's outrageous.
Okay, and Carl, how do you feel about PR versus first past the post?
Well, I think it's not the electoral system that's the main problem. I think it's the main political parties that are not offering anybody anything. We need a new workers' party that would stand up for all of us, for the millions, not the millionaires, not the 1%, but the 99%.
But how would they get elected then if you don't have proportional representation? Do you think you can win the majority of July the 4th?
With the policies, campaigning, one man, one vote.
You think you can? Okay. Bambos, what about you? I mean, you're in a party that is, according to the opinion polls, going to win decisively, and you could win a super majority on something like 39 to 41% of the votes. How fair would that be?
Yeah, I think it is totally unfair, and I support electoral reform. I support proportional representation, because for many people, their votes won't count in this election, and the election will be decided in relatively few. Well, I mean, this election will be very different from other ones, but I think some votes just will not count in certain seats, and that for me is unfair. We use proportional representation in the different nations, so we have them in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and we also have them for the London Mayor and the London Assembly. So I think we do need to. I would very much welcome a change. The only caveat I would have is there needs to be a link between the constituency and the member who represent it, but I think that can be done quite easily. So I'm a strong advocate for PR, and even though Labour will more than likely have a big majority, I still don't think it's right that 60% of the population have voted for a different party.
But the problem, Matt, is if Labour has a big majority, the voices like Bambos's might be drowned because they like the power of getting in on a smaller percentage vote. I mean, how do you feel on that? And I know the Lib Dems have been in favour of PR for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, if the Liberal Democrats exist for any single reason, it's to remake the system. That is our very reason for existence. We are not in the two bigger parties because we believe the system itself is broken and needs reforming. That's not just PR. It's also a significant reform to the House of Lords and having an elected upper chamber and various other changes, including massive devolution to local authorities and putting power in the hands of local people. But on the specific issue of PR, obviously, we proposed the referendum on the alternative vote in 2011 and campaigned for that. It wasn't PR, but it was a step in the right direction. We lost that, unfortunately, and it's disappointing that Labour didn't back that change when it could have done. I'm really pleased to hear Bambos say he's personally in support of PR, and I think what he needs to do is spend the next couple of years convincing his colleagues to put through a change to the electoral system while they have the ability to do so. Because Tony Blair provisionally made a deal with Paddy Ashdown where the Lib Dems would support a minority Labour government in '97, and then they'd bring in PR if that happened. He won a massive majority, reneged on it. We can't have Keir Starmer do that, because all that will happen is we could have Nigel Farage as Prime Minister in 5 years' time if the stars align.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the problem that you raised, the massive majorities, because power tends to influence you. Cherith, obviously, you are in a small party at the moment, but a successful one locally. What's your view on changes to PR?
Yeah, I mean, it's even more. I mean, Jeff was right when we said Caroline Lucas effectively had one MP for 800,000 plus votes, and for every Tory MP, there were only 50,000 votes. That's really and for every Scottish National Party, that was just like 26,000 votes. So that's a massive, massive difference in terms of the democracy failing in the current first past the post system. And sadly, in the Labour manifesto, they are not supporting a fair electoral system right now. I'm glad that Bambos has said what he said, and I hope he'll be able to persuade his colleagues to do something quite different. Because what's worse is that though when we knock on doors, many people still say they want to vote Green, but they won't vote Green because of for tactical vote purposes. So what you have is Labour might have 39–40% of votes in the election, but really most of those will also be a significant amount of that will also be tactical votes. So really the lack of democracy is really blatant there. And for Labour to end up with a supermajority will be really a scandalous situation in terms of democracy.
I mean, Bambos, you're brave enough to say that you believe in PR. What sort of support do you think you would have in the Parliamentary Labour Party amongst your colleagues? Because you might be fighting an uphill battle, but it's a battle that others say is worth fighting. How successful do you think you can be in influencing others?
Well, I think you'll find there is more support than you'd think. I mean, certainly at recent Labour Party conferences, motions have been passed on having PR. Obviously, conferences are not binding on the party leadership, but it does send a message. Certainly the unions are very keen on PR. I mean, I don't know how many or who most of my colleagues are going to be after Thursday if I'm elected. But I think that you will find that many younger MPs do favour PR. So there might well be a groundswell there. I don't know, but I'm certainly in support of it and happy to be publicly say that. Okay,
well, I mean, that's great. And, you know, I think we've sort of come to the end of the sections now that we said we would go through. So it just remains now for you to sort of give your promo at the end. And, you know, you have 30 to 45 seconds really to say why vote for me, except for Matt, he's going to say why vote for Lauren. So he's the odd one out. So, okay, let's start with you, Jeff. Why should people vote for you?
George Galloway set up the Workers' Party as an alternative to the Labour Party. The Labour Party is no longer what it says on the tin. It's become a mechanism for gaining and retaining power, and that's it. The expulsion of Jeremy Corbyn from the party was outrageous. I ordinarily would be voting Labour, but I will not vote for a party led by Keir Starmer, who's an inveterate.
But why would they vote for you? That's what we want to know about. We know why you don't want people to vote Labour, but we want to know why people should vote for you.
A return to old school Labour values, looking after the people, not profit. It's as simple as that. The many, not the few.
Okay, and Carl, why do you think people should vote for you?
I think they should vote for me because I want to be a voice for the trade unions and for the working class. It's not just about this election, though. It's about what happens after this election. So working people need their own party. So I want to see a new party come about based on the trade unions and community-based organisations as well, because we are a community of people and we are the working class.
Okay, thanks. And Matt,
thank you.
Why should people vote for not you but for Lauren?
Yeah, so obviously I'm not Lauren Fulbright. I'm her election agent. Lauren, I've known for a couple of years. She's genuinely passionate about improving our local area. And the thing about having a Liberal Democrat MP is that they're actually, when you elect Liberal Democrats, whether at council level or at local at parliamentary level, they're very difficult to get rid of. They're very difficult for our opponents to get rid of us because they do such a good job. Liberal Democrats are famous for having our local champions, standing up for local residents, fighting on local issues. I've already talked about the Edmonton incinerator. There are lots of local issues where having a strong independent voice, not associated with the Labour Party, given that Labour run both Enfield and Haringey councils, would be really beneficial. I think the likelihood is that the overwhelming likelihood is we're going to have a Labour government come the 5th of July. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial. So if you do believe in having something different locally, please vote your conscience, vote Liberal Democrat, and help elect Lauren Forbright on 5th of July. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm sure she'll like what you've said. And Boss, why should people vote for you?
I've been the MP for Enfield Southgate for 7 years. I'm now standing as a Labour candidate for Southgate and Wood Green. If people think I've done a good job, then I would very much like to continue doing that. In that time, I've dealt with 50,000 issues raised by constituents. I've spoken up in Parliament about local issues, including waiting lists at North Mid and crime and cuts to budgets for schools. I've met with local groups, and I'm very happy to keep doing that and be a real local voice for the people of Southgate and Wood Green.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Gareth, why should people vote for you in the Green Party?
Well, under the first past the post system, many people plan to vote tactically for Labour this time because they clearly want the Tories out. But the Labour supermajority in Parliament would mean that their Tory austerity agenda will go unchallenged. The Labour's has a manifesto built on a made-up fiscal rule and fails to tax the enormous wealth of their new donors. Basically, Labour have changed into a new Tory party. So here in Southgate and Wood Green, the Tories cannot win. They are polling only 16%. So you can safely elect me to push for ambitious and bold policies in the next Parliament. I've lived here for 30 years and I've served as a local councillor. So I would really like to challenge the Labour supermajority in Parliament. So please vote Green for real hope and real change.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. You know, the decision's going to be made on July the 4th, if not very long from now. And it's great that you've come on, because having this sort of community engagement and allowing people to hear your views locally, I think is really important. And I think I feel sorry for the Southgate and Wood Green candidates, because you've had so many hustings that it's been difficult for you. And so, you know, coming on this one as well, I think says a lot for you and what you've been doing. So on behalf of Locomotion and NCAF and Enfield Despatch who's worked with us, I'd like to say a big thank you. And thanks to all those people who worked on this, like Paul and Nena and Panos, and also the companies working with us to help get this, you know, put before as many people as possible. So, you know, this will be on Facebook and it will go on as a YouTube video. I think almost pretty well quickly after we finished, and I think we'll get a lot of views on that if yesterday's hustings was to go by. So thank you. We have our final hustings on Monday, which is July the 1st, and that's Enfield North. And Nena is going to be chairing that. We have decided to have a different chairperson for each of the hustings, which I think has been really important because it shows different styles and it helps a lot. So thank you all for attending, and we'll close this hustings now.